Davis, in particular, did a fantastic job in exposing it. And they did so against all sorts of pressures and resistance from this very powerful news organization. That's one aspect of Hacked Off, that is, it's thrilling to read. I'm pretty confident when Nick Davis produces his book about it, it will be, not just a great book, but a great movie. And I'm sure people are casting themselves in the movie as we sit around here. But there is another side to this. And it's this. I've just talked about what The Guardian did. What did the rest do? Well, this has been measured. What did the other papers do? In the 4 years after the first hacking was revealed, The Guardian published 237 articles about the hacking scandals. That's what you do when you've got, a running story, when you've got a really good story to get your teeth into. You go on and on about it. In the same period, to take one group of titles, the Mail papers published 37 stories about it. And most of those stories were not saying, here is an extraordinary scandal involving royal princes and so forth. Most of those stories were saying the Guardian is barking up the wrong tree, this is politically driven, it's all against, to score points off David Cameron because he's employing Andy Coulson, or, belittling the story or marginalizing it. Now, the Mail is, in its way, a rival of the Guardian. It's also, in its way, a rival of Rupert Murdoch's papers, is it not? You would think, in the dog-eat-dog world of newspaper journalism, they would be keen to score points off a rival publisher which was in trouble. You'd think the same about the Mirror group newspapers, the Daily Mirror, the Sunday Mirror, the People. You'd think that they would want to score points particularly. Bitter rivals of the Sun and the News of the World. They, in those 4 years, published 11 stories about phone hacking. So what is my point? Well, my point is well made by Rupert Murdoch himself. In an interview back in the 60s, which you can find on YouTube with the BBC, Murdoch was asked about newspaper power. And he said that, of course, newspapers had great power to expose wrongdoing and shine light into dark corners. And he went on, they also had a great power for evil, which was the power to hide stories, to conceal stories. Those are his words, a power for evil. Now, I think what was happening in the failure to report the phone hacking scandal, as I say, absolutely grist to the mill, an excuse to write about Sienna Miller. These are papers that had been writing about Sienna Miller if she changed her hat, but no, now they stopped writing about her when it was a story about hacking. What was going on? Why were they not reporting this sensational story that The Guardian had? The Guardian, there's one of the smallest circulation newspapers in the country. Two other papers picked up the hacking story, the Financial Times and the Independent. They're the two also, between the three of them, the smallest circulation papers in the country. What was going on? This was a concerted effort by the companies that produce the leading newspapers in this country, the biggest circulation newspapers in this country, a concerted effort to conceal a scandal. Now, if you think about what journalism is for and what newspapers are for, they're for informing the public. They're for making you and me informed citizens, ensuring that we know what is going on. They have a power to do that. It's a fantastic and valuable thing. But as I say, they have a great power for evil, which is to hide things. And here they were hiding something that shamed them. It wasn't the first time. If you go back another few years beyond phone hacking, you'll find the scandal of Motorman. This is a revelation by the Information Commissioner of industrial-scale data mining. Sounds a sort of impersonal sort of thing. It's not at all impersonal. It is about acquiring the personal data, the private information of ordinary people. And I stress ordinary people. Most of the victims of hacking are people you never heard of. Most of the victims of Motorman were people you've never heard of. There's an extreme instance of somebody who was a supplier of hearing aids who was targeted in Motorman. That's to say, a private investigator was commissioned by a national newspaper to find out details about this person. He was, as I say, a supplier of hearing aids, and he had a client who was famous. This is very wide-ranging. Thousands and thousands of people are involved in the Motorman affair. Again, the national newspapers were very, very reluctant to report it. They do not shine lights into their own backyard. It's shaming. I say it's shaming as a journalist. What do we do as journalists? We, as I say, shine lights. But we also, and I've done this, I mean, you've heard, I've done various jobs as a journalist. I have made myself unpopular with various police forces, with a number of quite big corporations. In fact, I made myself very unpopular at one stage with Yorkshire Water. I have made myself unpopular with various government departments, notably the Ministry of Defence. Now, I don't claim I'm not a very distinguished journalist. I'm not a hero in any way. It's part of the job that you go around poking these people and making yourself unpopular. I've also written leading articles, the editorials that you see in the papers, routinely. And in those, what do? You say, this company, this government department, this police force, this body has been, this airline, whatever, has been found wanting. The public has a right to know what has gone wrong. The public has a right to know that the corporation, whatever in question, is doing something about this thing that has gone wrong. Think, horse meat or whatever. Has a right to know that something is being done about it. That people are held accountable. And that steps are being taken to ensure it doesn't happen again. Those are the sorts of things that journalists are there for. So I say, you don't just shine the light, you provoke change. You try to protect the public. You try to effect openness about things. Those are the sort of things we do. Well, what are we if we won't shine light into our own world? What are we if we don't face up to the public and say, something terrible has gone wrong here? And I'll elaborate on that. Something terrible has gone wrong here. We will take responsibility for it. We will do what is required to make sure that there is change and that it will not happen again. We will make sure, we will apologize to the victims of this. We will, all of those things. That's exactly what we ask of other people as journalists. That is exactly what we pin them down and say, this government department is failing. It has to change. We have to be able to see change. We have to be able to see maybe heads roll. It's a common thing, you think. The guy who ran, I'm afraid his name's gone out of my head, was in Hatfield, who ran BP. He had to go. Fred Goodwin had to go. You could produce long, long lists of people who had to go. Yeah? We do that. We demand accountability of a very public kind. But in journalism, alas, in newspaper journalism, that's not what happens. What happens is the story gets hidden. That was what was happening. That was why there had to be a public inquiry. There had been such a build-up of these hidden stories, the public was no longer fooled. They were leaking out here, there, and everywhere, and the public was not fooled. And when the Millie Dowler story broke, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. There had to be a public inquiry. Now, what was it about that public inquiry? What was different about that public inquiry was that we knew by then that it wasn't just the papers. We knew that there was a problem with the police because hacking was against the law. The police had known in 1996 that there were hundreds of victims of hacking and that there were almost certainly a significant number of perpetrators. The police knew that in 1996. They told, interestingly, they told that to News International themselves in 1996. So why were the police not prosecuting? Why were they not chasing this story? Why were they not bringing people before the courts? And the politicians are implicated, aren't they? Because we see, or they appeared to be implicated. We see the closeness of David Cameron personally, for example, to News International. So he'd employed Andy Coulson, former editor of the News of the World, as his media boss, director of communications, probably one of the 3 or 4 people closest to the Prime Minister in the country. He had a reasonably long-standing personal and close friendship, as we know, with Rebecca Brooks, the chief executive of News International. He was very chummy with others at News International. That is something to concern the public in an environment where there is significant criminality at News International and where the police are not investigating it properly. You have to ask, is that political connection connected? So when the public inquiry was set up, this wasn't just an ordinary public inquiry. It was being set up partly because we could not trust the politicians to go in and sort this out. We could not trust the police on their own to go and sort this out. It had to be an independent investigation. The public would settle for no less. It was a pretty thorough one. Senior judge, very senior judge put in charge, Lord Justice Leveson. He sat, the inquiry went on for, 14 months, something like that, heard hundreds of witnesses and thousands and thousands of pages of submissions and evidence. He heard everybody's point of view, including all the national newspaper editors, representatives of the regional press. He heard everybody who had a stake in this. He listened to their case, their arguments. This wasn't an investigation into phone hacking, it was an investigation into the culture that led to it. He heard all of this evidence. He looked particularly closely at the Press Complaints Commission. This was the body which the industry has been saying for years and years and years was upholding standards in the press. He looked very closely at it, and he decided that it wasn't. That actually, he decided, the Press Complaints Commission routinely put the interests of the press before the interests of the public, so that if you complained to it, what you were essentially doing was placing yourself in the hands of the press, and at their discretion they might apologize to you or not. They had a code of practice, which, as Leveson points out very clearly, they obeyed when they chose. The Press Complaints Commission was toothless. So he reviews all of this. And at the end of it, what does he do? Well, let's look at some of the things he didn't do. He didn't introduce statutory regulation, or he didn't propose it, not remotely. I'll come back to that. This was what we were warned of. You know, we would have state regulation indeed. The papers on the eve of publication of the Leveson report were telling us we were slipping into North Korea and Zimbabwe. Well, no, he didn't recommend anything like that at all. He didn't pillory the editors and the proprietors of these newspapers. He didn't pillory the titles of the newspapers. He was actually very general. He avoided saying who did what to whom and pinning blame. He makes some very, very penetrating general observations. The one that sticks in the mind is that too often national newspapers wreaked havoc in the lives of ordinary people. But he didn't go saying, and this paper and this editor ought to be ashamed of themselves and this editor ought to be dismissed now. He didn't do any of that. Now, if you think what the press would do, I probably ought to be a bit grateful for that. He didn't propose compulsory regulation. This was something that newspapers had pleaded with him about. They had made a case that forcing newspapers to be members of making it obligatory to be members of a regulator would be equivalent to licensing, something that was ceased to happen in British newspapers, in the British press in the 17th century. He didn't impose or propose a statutory right of reply. There's a long list of these things he didn't do. It was actually a good deal for the press. What he said was, go away, set up a reputable, independent self-regulator. You set it up. I'm leaving that to you. Okay? Now, you've probably all heard the expression, the last chance saloon. The press are drinking in the last chance saloon, a government minister said in 1989, in terms of press regulation. There is a long history of the failure of press self-regulation. And Leveson acknowledged that. And he said that he would not be doing his duty by the public, he would not be offering the public the protection it needed if he just left the press to do it again, if he gave them another simple round in the last chance saloon. So he said that once in 3 years, this self-regulator should be subjected to inspection. Once every 3 years, somebody should come around and inspect this self-regulator to make sure it wasn't another poodle like the PCC. So you have a body that will come and it will check that this thing is acting to protect the public and not to preserve the interests of the newspaper editors. So if people take a complaint to this body, or if things go wrong in the industry, this self-regulator acts. It does something that makes a difference. So there has to be an inspection body, an auditor, yeah? That needs to be clearly set up to be independent of both the press and certainly independent of politicians. You don't want something acting on behalf of the state. Something independent of both the press and the politicians acting on behalf of the public to ensure, as I say, that this self-regulator is doing its job properly, is meeting basic standards for regulation. Okay? So that's what Leveson proposed. This body, this inspecting body, will be set up under statute, a one-off involvement of Parliament, in a very public way. The whole process will be very public. You read Leveson, he says, everything about this has to be done in the open. Yeah? From the moment I report, there is an immediate need for openness, he says, the immediate need. All done openly. You set up, you write a bill, you agree a bill, he calls for cross-party consensus on this, and he says, you agree a bill, you pass it through Parliament, you create this thing, it is then independent of you. It is not ruled in any way by politicians. It is freestanding, this body. But it is also independent of the press. And it's like a very small quango. Once in 3 years, it goes and it looks at the self-regulator and it says, does it meet this list of tests which Leveson has given us? Is it, in itself, effective in acting on behalf of complainants? Does it deal with complaints properly about the press? Does it, for example, act when newspaper stories are plainly untrue or unfair? Does it act when newspapers plainly breach the requirement to respect grief and shock? Does it do those things? That's what the body has to check, okay? That is what Leveson proposed. It does not seem to me to be extreme. And I, as a journalist, feel that it offers me and people like me a kind of protection. Because what it says is, I have high standards. This is somebody who is prepared to be held accountable for his or her standards. This is a newspaper that is prepared to be held accountable for its standards. It will not abuse its power. It will not intrude without justification into the private lives of people. It will not steal their personal data. It will not hack their phones. And if it does, if it gets into the business of routine breaches of the code, and you all know the current code, I have very few problems with the current code of practice of the PCC. The code isn't the issue, it's the enforcement. If there are systematic failures, then somebody has to go and investigate. Now just rewind a little to the McCann case. That was a case in which, by my estimate, there were thousands and thousands of breaches of the PCC code, not to mention the libel law, over a period of months and months and months. Now, if I was working for something called the Press Complaints Commission, which had a mandate, and it did, to investigate when things went wrong, and I watched this thing unfold in front of me, I would look at myself in the mirror in the morning and say, is today the day I ought to be doing something? Is today the day I ought to be raising my voice about the abuses of the McCann family that are going on? Nobody ever did in the PCC. They had the power. They just didn't use it. It was extremely rare for the PCC to use its power to investigate. It did so in the case of phone hacking, and it condemned The Guardian. So the picture from Leveson is he is generous to the press, but he also makes requirements on the press in relation to the public. The self-regulator has to meet basic standards. It can't be another PCC. So what has happened since then? Well, very briefly, on the day before the Leveson publication, there was cross-party consensus. All three parties agreed that they would implement Leveson's proposals on press regulation if they were not, in the case of Labour, it was workable and practical or something like that. Similar words from the Lib Dems. And the Prime Minister's word was bonkers. He would implement the Leveson proposals if they weren't bonkers. A cross-party consensus. On the day the report is published, David Cameron departs from that consensus. So the two other party leaders say, yeah, we'll do it. David Cameron stands up in the House of Commons and says, well, actually, I'm a bit worried about this recognition body, this inspection body, being set up by statute. That's a Rubicon for me. That's a line I won't cross, or I'm reluctant to cross. Now, David Cameron had spoken many, many times on these issues before November the 29th last year. He had never mentioned this Rubicon. Not once. Not even under oath in front of Leveson had he said, no, I would not ever legislate. Never said it. But on the morning, on that day, looking himself in the mirror and shaving, he decided, no, I have a Rubicon. And I wonder where that came from. Well, we have a little help in working out where that came from. Because since then, the Conservatives have come forward with proposals for a royal charter to set up this body. Now, this is a dusty medieval instrument, but hey, I don't have a closed mind. If it works, if it's legally strong, let's see if it can work. They said to us at Hacked Off, yeah, we can make this work. We can implement the whole of Leveson with a royal charter, and that will save David Cameron from crossing his Rubicon. But what happened? They drafted a royal charter, and then the press stepped in and said, no, we don't like this, and we don't like that. We don't like that, and that. Dozens and dozens and dozens of things they didn't like. And what are they trying to achieve? Well, they want to be able to choose who sits on the inspection body. Who are their inspectors? So instead of being able to mark their own homework, as they used to be able to do, and Leveson said they couldn't, they were going to pick the people who mark their homework. That's great, isn't it? That's going to make a big difference. They wanted to pick and choose who could make complaints. So for points of general accuracy, they framed a form of words which is actually worse than the present arrangement of the Press Complaints Commission. Harder to complain. And so on. There's a long list of these alterations. As I said, we went to see Oliver Letwin, the minister responsible for this charter proposal, and we said, why did you change that? And he said, in response to representations from the press. Quite open about it. Why did you change that? In response to representations from the press. Again and again and again, the same form of words. So what they're trying to do is fix it. And they're trying to fix it behind the scenes. None of this is open in the way that Leveson said. I said there was an immediate need, Leveson spoke of, for openness in these issues. None of it is open. It's all behind closed doors. The stuff about the press, they've written these bullying letters to ministers saying, no, this isn't good enough. Change that, change that, change that. And they've done it. So what will we end up with if that goes ahead? What will we end up with? We will end up with another PCC. Now, I could take you back through history at all of the failures of these things, but what is happening is that history is repeating itself. That I spoke of the very powerful organizations that run newspapers and their control over the what we can talk about and what we know about and what we don't know about. They are pulling these strings. They are fixing these things behind the scenes. That is what's going on. Now, it doesn't have to happen. It can be stopped. Go to the Hacked Off website and you'll find out how. But we do not, and I speak as a journalist, we do not want to end up with another PCC because it's not good for journalism and it is very bad, very, very bad for many members of the public who find themselves written about by people who don't care what they think, don't care whether it's fair or unfair, true or untrue, because they're not accountable. You're sitting on a desk in London on a national newspaper, and you're writing about somebody off a piece of agency copy from Grimsby. You think to yourself, well, what's this loser ever going to do to me? I can write what I like about him. And that is the sort of thinking, I can write what I like about him because I'm not accountable. The boss isn't accountable. Nobody's accountable here. I can write what I like. Those people, your guy in Grimsby, is then traduced, a mockery in his local community. There are many, many examples of this. I recommend that you go to the submission made to the Leveson inquiry. It's all still there online, thank goodness, by MediaWise, an organization that has been representing victims of press abuses for 20 years. Just read it. It's not all celebrities. It's not even all McCanns and Christopher Jeffreys and people like that, Dowlers. There are hundreds and hundreds of people you've never heard of who've been abused in ways that you would not tolerate if they happened to you or your family. Why would a journalist want to do that sort of thing to people? Why would a journalist want the power to demand change in other institutions, but not be prepared to accept that there needs to be change in his or her own world? Why would we be like that? What is the change? The change is you have to check your stuff. How bad is that? I'm sure you're all taught to check your stuff. So it wouldn't be an extra burden, would it? You have to be fair to people. You have to think, if I'm going to harm somebody, and you can cause great harm, you have to think, if I'm going to harm somebody, can I really justify that? Is it in the public interest? Measure that. Those sorts of things are not particularly challenging to a journalist who is a real human being. But I'm afraid they are challenging to the kind of journalist who, and I will end with an infamous quote from somebody at the News of the World. It happened in 2002. It was a taped conversation between two members of staff, one of them a news editor, one of them a reporter. It's indicative of the sort of world that was, that they taped each other in conversation. And the news editor says to the reporter, well, this is what we do, Charlie. We go out and destroy other people's lives. Now, you don't want to be like that. You don't need to be like that. You have nothing to fear from effective independent press regulation. Nothing to fear from it. But those guys do. Thank you very much. Yep, of course, yeah.
Okay, your turn now, guys and ladies. Any questions for Professor Cathcart?
I'm sure you know that yesterday we had Neil Wallace in, and it was very provocative speech. He said right at the end, and I'm quoting out of memory, that you take money from self-serving celebrities and you're trampling 317 years of press freedom. That's directly to you. Obviously, this is going out live. How would you respond?
Well, of course, I don't do personal. So I'm not going to attack Neil Wallace. But I would point out that he worked for a substantial period of time for Rupert Murdoch. Now, is Rupert Murdoch a self-serving celebrity? None of the people that we've taken money from have done the sorts of things that the News of the World did to many, many people. None of those people have ever abused rights on the scale that they've been abused by the News of the World. I think that it's exactly the sort of language and defense mechanism that you hear from the press, which from parts of the press, from the editors and proprietors, that it's exactly the sort of defensive stuff that we wouldn't tolerate if banks were saying these sorts of things. We wouldn't tolerate it. The papers wouldn't tolerate it. They wouldn't have any patience for it. But we get this now from the press because they're desperate, they're bitter, they're angry, and they're not used to being challenged. They don't like it up them.
Oh, talking about being bitter and angry, it does look sometimes that some of your high-profile supporters, the likes of Hugh, Steve Coogan, can come over possibly as celebrities sulking a bit because they've been exposed, some of their foibles exposed in tabloid newspapers when they've made a fortune from public adulation in the past. I'd just like to hear a response to that.
Well, let's take Steve Coogan. What's he made a fortune from? Public adulation, because he's a comedy genius. Yeah. Look at it this way. What does Steve Coogan have to gain from being a supporter of Hacked Off? What can he possibly gain from it?
Vengeance.
Vengeance. What he gains from it, what he risks from it, is he puts his head up above the parapet. He doesn't need to do this. He puts his head up above the parapet and he gets abuse. The same is true of Grant. They risk. The same is true of Jerry McCann. What has he got to gain from going public and saying Leveson was a compromise? It's already a compromise. It mustn't be compromised again by another dirty deal with the press. What does he have to gain from it? Absolutely nothing. Vengeance. I am amazed at the courage of some of these people in coming forward and saying what they say. Particularly, go back and look at some of the videos of people giving evidence, some of them famous and some of them not. I'd recommend the evidence of Margaret Watson, for example, or J.K. Rowling at the Leveson inquiry. They are stepping forward in the hope that they can prevent other people from being subjected to the kinds of things that happen to them. I'm full of admiration for them. Revenge. If Hugh Grant were here, I've heard him say this, so I can repeat it. If Hugh Grant were here, he would say that if he thought for one moment that what was going on now was a threat to freedom of expression, a threat to the ability, for example, to expose wrongs in Parliament or in the health service or some of the other things we're told we're never going to hear about again, if he thought for one moment, he would switch sides immediately. I would suspect that that is true of pretty well everybody who gave evidence to Leveson. There was not a single soul saying there should be statutory regulation of the press, state regulation of the press, censorship. Not a single soul argued that in front of Leveson. But I think it's legitimate to ask, can we have a press that is accountable, that has to answer to the people it writes about? I think that's legitimate.
I was just wondering, a couple of things. First of all, what was the point in getting more regulation when the law's there? There's 60 journalists at the moment on remand or on bail because of things like phone hacking. The law's already in place, so surely the police should be more accountable rather than the journalists because the law's already there. Why do you need more red tape and more things like that?
There are several answers to that. One of them is that you have to ask yourself why the police are only acting now and not in 2006, or indeed back in 2002 when Motorman broke. That's a not insignificant question in all this. But there is another way of looking. There are several other ways of looking at this. One is that the press has been arguing since 1953 that it regulates itself. It has been arguing since 1953 that it is the only possible body to regulate itself. And that's not about merely upholding the law. That is about regulating itself. since the Press Complaints Commission came into being, there has been a code of practice, endorsed, indeed written, by editors, which says things like, and you've seen it, you must be fair, you must be accurate, you must respect grief and shock. It gives you guidance on how to write about suicide, for example. Now, the press insisted that that was a rigorously enforced code. Every journalist carried it, you may have heard this one, in his wallet, or her wallet. It was in every newsroom. It was written into everybody's contract, we were told. We were told that in the early 90s. In fact, it still wasn't written into everybody's contract. It still isn't today in member organisations. They said they would do it, but they never did. They believe that there is more to this than simply obeying the law. And it's true as well, if you think about, doctors. Do we wait for them to kill people before we deal with them? No, we don't. If a doctor behaves appallingly towards a patient, that doctor is reported to the appropriate regulator. Doctors are like that. The police are like that. Everybody is like that. Everybody knows what regulation is in the service world. Everybody knows. We don't wait for a crime to be committed in terms of what's in the things we eat. We have higher standards than that. The law is the last recourse. And actually, if we leave it just to the law, are we asking that there should be laws that there should be police officers coming into newsrooms all the time? I don't want that. I want journalists, I want news organisations to police themselves.
If I can interrupt you, though, wouldn't you say that more than 100 police officers, the argument in 2006 was that they had better things to do in terms of catching terrorists and what have you. Wouldn't you say that more than 100 police officers worked on those inquiries and folded them?
Well, one of the principal reasons why there were a lot of them is there was a lot of wrongdoing. And it was delayed. And one of the reasons why a great many officers were required on Operation Weeting was that there were a great many victims to be informed. And the police had not informed them when they first knew. And they first knew in 2006.
So that's a fault with the police, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I'm being asked about how many police officers are involved. Isn't that I'm answering that question.
It was about, it's the press who are kind of to blame for that when it is the police who, it's a shortfall with the police that you kind of want to punish the press for in a way. The press have, don't get me wrong, the things that have happened are bad, but you kind of need to.
Well, I just wonder how tolerant we would be of these arguments if we were talking about some other walk of life. Are there too many officers engaged in, I don't know, you name it. Are there too many people engaged in looking into horse meat? Are we measuring that? No. We just want the damn thing sorted out. I hear a lot of special pleading from journalists. It's easy to say, and editors and proprietors in particular, it's easy to say, oh, this is unfair, it's been got out of proportion. This is more about, this is all going to, shut us down and gag us. We're hard up. We're about to go out of business. It's the internet, really, that's the problem. There are every sort of alibi for this, including, I'm sorry to say, it's taking up a lot of police time. It's taking up a lot of police time because it was a crime. And it was a crime committed by a lot of people. And it is overdue that something was done about it.
Isn't it, you talked about sort of Leveson not pointing the finger of blame at anyone specific. Surely that's a failing of it, because sort of in the public's mind now that leads to a blurring of the line between the 1% of journalists who break the law and do all these things and the 99% who do things by the book and are perfectly innocent. Doesn't that sort of lead to a blurring of the lines?
If you're asking, would I have preferred Leveson to point the finger a bit more? Yes. I think it would have been helpful. But he chose not to do it. The package, and I recommend, it's a long report, but I recommend the summary report is, I don't know, 20 or 30 pages. It's easily readable. You can go online, read the executive summary. I recommend you read it. What he does is he tries to present something that is going to be acceptable. He clearly has constructed something that he wants and thinks can be acceptable. It's a good deal for the press. And there are lots of ways in which you can see that. One is the business of not packing it up, not wrapping in a whole lot of blame and finger pointing. Another is that he ends with quotes from John Major. So that John Major was the Prime Minister in the 90s. He was the Prime Minister who was in charge the last time there was something like this. And he spoke up very strongly. He said, this is the last chance saloon for the politicians. The politicians have to get it right this time. And he set out, read the quotes. It's quite dramatic. He said that this has to be done. We don't want politicians taking party political advantage. What we want is we want a good collective initiative. Leveson ends his report with a long quote from John Major. Why is he doing that? There's a conservative former prime minister, man of, a man with an absolute direct stake in this. And what he's saying is to the politicians, listen to this man. This is somebody who's been here. He thinks you should get it right this time. And it's all, lots of the report is packaged in those terms. He's being as nice as he can to everybody and saying, please do this. This is the modest proposal I'm offering. Please do it.
Sadly, we're running out of time. We have got somebody else booked in here at 12 o'clock. But time to take one more question.
Yeah, I was just interested in the data protection element of Leveson. There was a thing regarding recently about the chilling effect it would have on investigative journalism, the fact that you have to shred stuff if you're not going to use it for publication rather than just for background or to kind of get your research. And I was just wondering, as an academic, how do you feel about that kind of idea of basically destroying an archive or kind of letting sources know and reading things like that?
Well, I mean, I've spoken exclusively today about the press regulation side of things. There are other sides to Leveson, and you hear a lot about them. Data protection is one, whistleblowing is another. On whistleblowing, what does Leveson say? Leveson says that police whistleblowing is justified and legitimate. He doesn't say anything about anybody else's whistleblowing, apart from the whistleblowing of journalists in newsrooms. They should have a whistleblowing line to the regulator so that they can report if they're being put under pressure to do unethical things. The editors and proprietors don't want that. There are things about pace. You may have read some of this stuff. Journalists are going to be obliged to disclose their sources under something Leveson recommends. A complete misrepresentation of what Leveson recommends. I would recommend you go to Part G, Chapter 2, Paragraph 911. You see exactly what he recommends, which is, he says, I've heard only half of this argument. Perhaps you should go away and think about it, to the Home Office. That's all he says. Sorry, to finish with your point on data protection. On data protection, the background is that the Data Protection Act was, and I really recommend, if you're interested in this issue, go and read what Leveson says in some detail. On the Data Protection Act, he says that the law was adjusted with so many protections for journalists that it's a coach and horses situation. Journalists simply are not obliged under this law, effectively obliged, to respect people's private information. That's because the exemptions are so generous and because the penalties are so low. The cost of being convicted, the fines, are so low that private investigators working for the press would meet representatives of the Information Commissioner on their door and say, oh, God, not you again. Can I just not write a check? Can we please not go to court? The costs of these things were so low that the fines were lower than the actual cost of commissioning, the charge that the private investigators were making for finding this secret information, this private information. So Leveson says it has to be tougher. Now, I'm prepared, we're in talks with a lot of several leading investigative journalists and leading lawyers in this field to see whether Leveson has got anything wrong on data protection. And certainly I'm a journalist. We're a journalist freedom organization. Among other things, nobody else is proposing this, but we are, that there should be extended public interest defenses in things like the Bribery Act. In RIPA, we want better protection for journalists. But we are looking very closely at the Leveson proposals to see if they are inimical. But I would say, look at the whistleblowing stuff. Don't believe what you read in newspapers about Leveson, because they're just, for the most part, papers are lying about it.
Can I apologise to Professor Cathcart for cutting in midstream? Can I apologise to all of those of you who are keen to ask questions, and sadly we run out of time. But the room is booked from 12 o'clock, so we need to clear fairly quickly. Before doing so, though, I'd just like to thank Professor Cathcart for taking time out to travel up from London today to deliver a fascinating and gripping speech and counter-argument to another strong speech yesterday from Neil Wallace. Everybody here can just show their appreciation. I'm just freeline whip on.
No, it's all right. Absolutely.